So this is mechanics of transactions with regard to, so if you want to do a transaction, I don't know why it's doing that. Okay. One node requests transaction and broadcasts to peer-to-peer network consisting of different nodes. So in this case, transaction gets validated by one of the nodes, verified transaction, then sent to all other nodes. And there's fairly sophisticated mechanism how to approve this transaction. And if it's approved or validated, it goes to the blockchain and creates a new block. And then the transaction is complete. So this is more detailed view step by step. What happened, and in this case, you can see, you can, it involves a little bit of public key encryption, because the message that goes into the network is signed by the private key of the party that initiates transaction. And then the first node that receives that decodes that and creates a block and sends it to other participants in the network. And then it's transmitted to the whole networks, and then it's validated, as I said. And that's the whole mechanism. Now, why is that important? It is all mechanics. If you understand mechanics, you can map any application on your understanding of the mechanics. And I'll show you a little algorithm how to think about that. And then we'll talk about applications. So that's another view of that. I'll skip that. This somewhat dated slide that shows complexity and delivery time frame in terms of how many users would be involved in different type of applications. So if you're talking about currencies such as Bitcoin, there are potentially billions of users. There are hundreds of thousands of users. So the blockchains are now used for authentication of participants in different computer interactions between different parties. Smart contracts are deals with the family trust, performance proofs, and there may be millions of use of cases. And then autonomous organizations may be in the thousands of cases. So there are three types of blockchains that are basically in use. There is a public blockchain, meaning that any participant that has a computer and download free open source software, it can participate in a blockchain, meaning that he can maintain the copy of the blockchain and that person or she can initiate a transaction. So the simple flow chart, which is so useful in description of patents, as we know. The patent attorney would put numbers around those blocks and then say what happened in this block and this block and in this block, right? But in this case, if you want to write shared information, if you don't use blockchain. If you do, you have known writers and they untrusted, and or they can be trusted. If you don't use blockchain. But if you have unknown writers and they cannot be trusted, you potentially can use it. And then if you need to avoid going through your trusted party, in other words, you want this decentralized self-maintaining blockchain, if you have that, then you do that. And then finally, we will allow anybody to use, to participate in that and use public blockchain. If not, you can use hybrid blockchain, which means that you control who gets access to the blockchain. In most of the applications that are successful or somewhat successful, it is permission blockchain. With the exception of Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies, almost all applications use permission blockchain. Smart contracts is something that was apparently, in the context of the blockchain, was invented in Canada by a Russian immigrant named Butulin. And so the idea is that you have a script that can be executed automatically as a part of transaction. And the reason why it's called smart contract, because it's modeled on the idea of the contract. Certain conditions have to be met. And these conditions are specified in a contract between two or more parties. So typically how that works is the two parties define the contract. The contract is just a set of rules. You can see here a flow chart that if this condition, if that happens, is it yes or no, it can go this way or that way, and it's typical flow chart of verification of certain set of rules. And once they verified, the program can be stored in the blockchain. And then it can be executed anytime the blockchain is invoked as a database. Now, this is the a laundry list of different applications. So we're finally coming to application. Energy, internet advertising, food, agriculture, manufacturing and services, real estate transaction, insurance, medicine, election, digital credentials, art, and something for developing world, which can help to deal with corruption. I'm going to go through some of these applications in more details, just a list of what you can see.
So, Leon, just to be clear, this isn't an exhaustive list, because you and I had discussed an idea of using it for deployment of software, so you could run trusted software. So you could have lots and lots more applications, I think.
Yes, yes, but it's meant to be what is written in the literature as a commercial application, where large or medium-sized companies deploy this type of technology. But you're right, there are other applications as well. So these are the benefits and drawbacks of adoption by different areas. They all again have a short list. Remember, we started with the faster, cheaper, and better. So cheaper, reduced cost, easier information access, more convenient, easier fraud detection, all these things. Lack of sufficient legal framework. This is the drawbacks. I usually pay more attention to the drawbacks than benefits for obvious reasons, because if you close your eyes, you should be able to come up with the list of benefits without my help. So the drawbacks requires a little bit more experience and understanding of what's going on. And so drawbacks are always more interesting. And actually, if you start thinking about inventions or using all those things, you ought to think about drawbacks upfront. Lack of standards, something dear to my heart. In fact, this is one of the very significant impediments to the use of this technology, because integrating many different parties without standards, it's almost impossible task. I just got a latest computer magazine which described application of blockchains into supply chains. And so what happens in supply chains, I'll show you in a short while the diagram how that works. But in a supply chain, you have multiplicity of participants that use totally different IT systems. And integrating their information that coming from this system and can be used by their system without standards, it's almost impossible. Old EDI standards, lack of XML adaptability, all these things are significant impediments. Now, lack of universal language from cross-border information exchange, it is a major problem. And there are several organizations that are either calling for creation of these standards or working on these standards. Again, I'll show you later organizations and what's happening there. And then you can see the list of benefits. This is publicly available source that I found extremely useful. I put underneath of that a link, URL. This is just downloadable in PDF. It's a very reasonably written large report which deals with all sorts of issues. It's a blockchain for supply chain and international trade, because in the context of Europe and European Parliament, it's very important. But it's broader than that. So this is some of the table of contents. So those of you who are really seriously interested in that, I highly recommend that, because it deals with tons of different aspects of this, including use cases, including expectation and challenges and perception of those things by key decision makers, see all these case technological aspects. And then if you look at the page 117 here, initiatives on blockchain at EU level. Some of these initiatives is a call to organization that I spent lots of time in Europe. It's called CEN, Center European de Normalisation. And it's a strong call for this organization to start standardizing important information aspects of this technology. So legislative framework at all. Anyway, that's a useful source. Now, if you look at this slide, this is from that report, exactly from, I borrowed that from that report. It's called Current and Future Adoption and Use Cases. You see underneath, you see blockchain enabled. So on x-axis is potential impact on international trade, which is what European Commission and European Parliament is extremely interested in the context of Europe. 26 countries are trying to create a smooth, easy international trade environment. On this axis is current and foreseen adoption to 2025. And on the left-hand side, it's sort of low impact, proof of concept, high impact. So you can see that. Decentralized marketplace seems to be not very important. So it's kind of low impact and not and far from implementation. Now, proof of authenticity, it's in this context, it means European industry, luxury industry, in many instances represents significant portion of European economy. And so working on proof of authenticity, and that's a broad notion, it's not only the products, but also sourcing the products from sustainable sources. All these things deals with proof of authenticity. And that seems to be moving forward. If I have time, I may be able to show you application. Now, maritime insurance, it's this, and it's moving. It's a proof of the concept. The largest shipper of containers called Maersk, you probably, if you drive on the highway, you see these trucks carrying these huge containers with the name Maersk on it. Maersk enabled, with the help of IBM, this joint venture between IBM, that deals with this maritime shipping and insurance. Now, cross-border payments are obvious things, and it's really moving forward the fastest of all, because in context of Europe, of course, as you know, there is in 16 out of 26 countries the same currency. In other 10, there is different currencies. But still, because of the lack of harmonization between taxes and other things, there are significant problems with cross-border payments. So now, ethical source tracking, I already mentioned that, that's becoming important. I read today, for example, that if you're buying gold on the market, the price for ounce of gold is close to $2,000. Large, very famous jewelry producer in Europe is paying $4,000 for the ounce of gold and pricing their jewelry accordingly, because they claim this is ethically sourced gold, not the one that it's commodity. So it's this one. And then shipping tracking system, that deals with the overall supply chain. I'll show you in a second what it is. And finally, e-certificate of origin, it's sort of related to the proof of authenticity. That slide I borrowed from the company called Factom. And you can see here their projection where the blockchain industry will go. The blue bar is financial application, including Bitcoins. The green bar is healthcare, cybercurrency, sorry, it's the blue bar, it's financial application just within financial industry. This is cybercurrency. Supply chain is the yellow bar, and overall IoT, Internet of Things, which some people, by the way, consider supply chain as a special case of IoT. But that's where the projections are. I won't bother you with detailed analysis of those things, but this is in view of, remember, I tried to describe the setup, how the whole sort of blockchain setup looks like. The network of computers that can communicate peer-to-peer. This is the second part of the puzzle. If you know this plus that, and you can ask this question with regard to your specific applications, you should be able technically to figure out whether your application is really good material for a blockchain technology. So now applications. I have that because that's from a German report, actually from a book. I found, this is a quote, I found it's extremely stupid. It attracted my attention to the point that I decided to quote that to you. How do you like that? Blockchain is mutualized, multi-master state machine replication system. How's that sound? Does anybody understand that? Can anybody explain that to me? I mean, I do intuitively understand the intent.
I know what a state machine is.
And how about the replication system?
I know what a machine is.
Okay, but
I can try. Okay, Leon, thank you so much for getting into the most technical and sophisticated state. Well, I try to learn things from a very as the simplest intellectual form. As I said, please correct me, because classically the problem of the trust is established by a hierarchical network. Now with the prevalence of the internet, so essentially it's a distributed network. So you don't know where is the source of the node. Whoever communicate to the from the transmitter to the receiver. So without the centralized hierarchical architecture, you have to redefine how this finite machine from the inputs to the authenticity of the original transmission from the transmitter. So as I see it, okay, essentially the way using in a fully distributed network with arbitrary topology, the only way you can get authenticities is through the routing of the intermediate routes.
No,
So
I understand that. I mean, we digressing from the subject matter here. So
I think I might be able to contribute something.
Yeah.
As it turns out, multi-master replication is actually a legitimate thing for database replication, which allows a group to be a kind of peer-to-peer replication where any member of the group can make a change to the database and the consistency propagates across all of the members. And then master-slave replication in comparison says only one element is able to make a change to the database. Everybody else has to simply copy it over. And the goal is to have some sort of database consistency. What they've done when they inserted state machine in between multi-master replication system is they modified an accepted term of the field. And they said, well, there's this state machine thing in there. And they're saying that blockchain is just a state machine. And the rest of it is like a giant database where they try to maintain consistency. And mutualized just means it's shared. So that just means there's a lot of them. And so that's a little bit redundant.
Well, it's a good explanation. It reminds me, I was once deposed on a patent lawsuit. And the attorney that was representing opposite side was trying to catch me with some similar type of things that the sentences was, don't you think it's this or that? And I decided that the proper answer is this. In front of me is a sentence, and each term in this sentence I understand, but as a collection of terms, it doesn't make any sense. And that was the end of this questioning. So he stopped questioning anymore about those things. So this is a little bit over the board to my sense, but I understand from a technical point of view. It's taken not from a technical paper, but from a business paper. Now, so what is insurance? So you have assets that can be uniquely identified, and they presumably difficult to destroy or replicate, and they can be registered in a blockchain. And so this type of registration can be used to ascertain the ownership of these assets. That's what insurance is all about. So any property, and you can think of real estate, automobiles, art, if it's physical or digital, can be potentially registered in a blockchain. When we start talking about that, remember we talked about binding between physical objects and their digital representation. This is the single most important issue in case of insurance. That issue represents significant challenges in order to get all the benefits of the blockchain. Supply chain. There are three issues with supply chain: counterfeit, visibility, traceability, and efficiency. It's better, faster, and cheaper. So the idea of supply chain, as you know, is to go from raw materials to production to distribution system and ultimately to the end users. And it turns out that the objects that are moving through supply chain, they can be counterfeited, which happens every day, and it's a huge problem. Visibility, traceability is another problem. If you can get information about an object that was inside supply chain 7 days after that object left supply chain, it's a problem. And efficiency play is obviously how much you have to pay for the information in order to get all the benefits. So this is a diagram. This is IBM example, comes from IBM. IBM is very big into supply chain. If you look at here, you have IoT platform. What it means, IoT platform, that you have a whole bunch of sensors that are connected. Temperature sensor is an obvious example. In supply chain, you need to maintain temperature of certain physical assets that moving through supply chain. Otherwise, they get spoiled. You can have other sensors that are connected to the internet. Now, this is that IoT blockchain metadata. It's information that comes from IoT platform. The whole environment called AI managed beef distribution. That's the example they want to give you. The blockchain starts with the first participant, which happened to be a farmer. The farmer grows animals and then sells them to processor, which kills them and processes them and create. And then you have a distributor that package them and distributes them to retailer, and then you have a customers, and then you have regulators. That's the typical participants in this case. Now, the example here is the farmer organic beef rancher in Argentina. And in this very fancy case, the beef can be labeled with bioprint, which means inserted with certain information that it's digitized and can be retrieved without major difficulty. So this is the front end. The back end is the blockchain. So then the smart contract is created, which specifies what should happen with all this beef and what should happen in case of different types of conditions. So for example, the temperature exceeds allowed threshold or something like that. And then finally, the beef travels through all these things and get to a restaurant. And the diner in this example can check this bioprint to verify that the beef is fresh, it's not contaminated, and it comes from this source. That's the idea of this particular example. So what we have three different benefits here. Increase in trust and quality, presumably on the part of these people, restaurant and consumer. Increase in trust in provenance, presumably by these people as well, but possibly also regulators, and increase in efficiency and revenue, because these things presumably creates and enables access to the information much faster than alternatives. So it's a wordy description of what I just described to you. IBM. So IBM uses something called Hyperledger. This is open source Linux Foundation blockchain implementation. So IBM decided not to use their own implementation of blockchain, or they would be able easily to do that, but they prefer to use this Hyperledger. And so these are the different applications they are peddling it for. And a couple of weeks ago, IBM invited me to participate in a similar conference that we're having today. So IBM brought a whole bunch of people, present their cases of using IBM blockchain. And I'll talk to you about that in a second. But the reason why IBM sort of really interested in that, my understanding that IBM seems to be feeling that they missed the revolution with Amazon and Apple and Google and Facebook, and they think that the blockchains will be the next big thing that is sort of on the same scale that those that I just mentioned. Well, it's another example. It's a rather trivial example. Let's say that you have a shareholders and you want to use blockchain as a mechanism to enable voting by shareholders. And you can see the chairman authorizes distribution of information to the shareholders, and then the shareholders create transaction, and then the block with that transaction, which obviously would contain all this information: the name of the shareholder, number of shares, the options that the shareholder selected for the payload. And that information goes to the auditor, and auditor validates the block, and then the block goes into the blockchain. And the benefit of this type of arrangement is that all participants, all shareholders, can see who voted how, and then get a record of all the voting. It's another trivial example. I show a little bit more sophisticated example. But the idea for the healthcare, for these electronic medical records, is that in this case, it's a laboratory technician, and he wants to attach new medical referral to the patient record. And so he creates the block goes into the blockchain, and then block is verified by other participants. Here's the blockchain, and then anybody can have access to that. Again, well, remember the arrangement. So you have a network of computers, right, which connected, and they can send information, receive information, verify information, all these things. And then you have your business application, how many people you want to share this information, whether you can trust them, all those things. If you have those two things, you can create 15,000 of this type of diagrams. It's fairly straightforward. It's not difficult. This is a little bit more sophisticated system. In this case, what they concern, the same thing, Doug, that you were concerned with creating your little device. So this is a healthcare, patient-centric healthcare system. You have wearable devices. You have something called trusted platform. It turns out that Intel, you probably know more about that than I do, but Intel created this trust execution environment, which in hardware, it's called Intel SGX. And it's fairly well protected against crypt attacks. So Intel SGX, it's everywhere. And then you can see this EHR manager, database, hospital. And so the data is shared. This is insurance company or research center. This is the blockchain. So all these participants can share information and can inquire about information in the context of this system. And because it's within trusted execution environment, you can ascertain identity management. You can do all sorts of useful things with that. That's another way from a user perspective. So this is presumably a user data collection device. So you can have your healthcare watch, you can have other devices on you, and you collect this data from these devices. Users can register it, and then it can be synchronized using, back to the previous chart, it would be user here, and that's what happened at the user end of this healthcare application. Well, another fairly idiotic application, but you can think of that, renting. So device user, so somebody who has a smart computing device, telephone, wants to rent a car from the car owner. So the car owner set the renting price and send this information in form of the contract together with the renting price to the device user. So device user then sends the token received here, verified, returned to the center, and then the car is unlocked and the device user can now drive the car. So it's called using smart contracts for renting application. This is what IBM talked about 2 weeks ago. So it turns out that the process of, this is traditional way of ownership transfer in the case of the cars. You have manufacturer, dealer, leasing company, lessee, and scrap merchant when the car is totaled. And then each one of them maintains in-house database ledger. And a regulator gets some of this information and they can verify, audit this information. That's a traditional way. The way with the blockchain is this way. So each of these become a node and they have shared ledgers and they have smart contracts, and then everybody communicates through a blockchain arrangement, or DLT. What they were talking about, there is a small company, or maybe not so small, I don't know. But the company that I'm talking about that IBM presented is in Denmark. And they claim that there are lots of problems with moving car around Europe. The car gets on the track, the car gets damaged. There are all sorts of things happening. They want to have information about all the events, and they want that information to be verifiable and instantly available to all participants in these things. And the whole business is really complicated because it turns out that finding drivers for these large trucks that moving cargo throughout Europe is excruciatingly difficult problem. It turns out that like 60% of these truck drivers are over 50 years old. Young people don't want to become truck drivers. So they were talking about alleviating some of those issues with that. Last time I talked about that already. So CryptoKitties is actually a computer game, and you get a digital information in a file, and it's unique information because it is maintained within the blockchain. And you can buy them and trade them, but they're unique, they cannot be replicated. That's the sort of, if you're in the business of collecting this kind of things, which I presume some people are, some people apparently pay hundreds of thousands for that. Now, all these things that I described to you is based on this notion of tokenization. It's taking a physical asset or maybe digital asset and then creating token out of that. That token is then stored in a blockchain, and you can manipulate the blockchain to obtain information about tokens. So these are different examples of what's happening in Europe. So Malta Stock Exchange security tokens for Clearstream Deutsche, this is a German stock trader platform. Commercial paper for Central Securities Depository if you're selling or buying commercial paper. So this is all the sort of, you can see, listing, admission, notary, regulated, all these steps can be organized via blockchain. Now, it all sounds good and well, except there are significant challenges with those things, because we created, when we discussed this blockchain, we created decentralized, accessible database that anybody can verify, and it's totally trustworthy. All these properties of the blockchains do not come for free, and you have significant defects related to that. Scalability is one of them. High latency is another one. In other words, the standard recommendation. If you're providing block, if you engage in a transaction on blockchain, and you are initiator of this transaction, you're providing the block to be appended to the blockchain, the recommendation is to wait 6-10 minutes because other people have to verify that. That's the latency. And you can have fake blocks, of course, they have to be rejected. And energy consumption, particularly in the case of Bitcoin, is a well-known problem. So the questions related to interoperability, speed, privacy, reliability are significant. And all practical applications, you really have to watch for them. So now let's talk about hype. So the hype, it seems to be going down a little bit. Although, if you look at the Google and you do, notification and these kind of things, you can see that IBM, as I mentioned, think that that's the next revolution. Now, this is my own example. That's my measurement of hype. It's Lian measurement of hype. These two volumes, Business Transformation to Blockchain, Volume 1 and Volume 2. They were $149.99. And for the purpose of this presentation, I acquired them for $8. So one was actually I bought at Kindle, and so total price was $12 as opposed to $300. So to me, it's measurement of hype. So how I do that? I carefully browse through both volumes, and I very carefully counted the number of insights that I got from reading these materials. And then I divided the number of insights by the price. That's my measurement of efficiency. So if I get 3 insights for the price of $12, it's pretty good. If I get 3 insights for the price of $300, it's pretty bad. I recommend that you adopt the same measure for that.
Yes.
Okay. Now, so it's a Gartner, the traditional curve of the hype, you know all about that. You can see here, this is somewhat dated, it's 2016, but you see cryptocurrencies here on this hype, they're already on the way down. On this chart, it's way down because Facebook attempted to create this cryptocurrency called Libra. Remember, they decided not to proceed with that anymore, but they seems to be almost at the bottom of those things. Based on my measurement of hype, it is. Nevertheless, if you read the literature, you will find the blockchain is still on the list of top 15 technologies in the world, at number 3. Doug, before we started this conversation, Doug and I talk about artificial intelligence, it still beats everybody else. And you can see the list, it's fairly self-explanatory. Now, these are the Gartner's information. So what is the interest in blockchain by industry? And you can see of all the people that they ask Gartner, the health players, healthcare. Now, why is that? Because this move to electronic health records and losing health records to cyber attacks is not advisable. I know of a large hospital, almost $4 billion hospital, whose chief executive officer is extremely concerned and asking, should we use this blockchain? So that explains this. Financial services is obvious, transportation, wholesale trade, you can see the list. Now, this is deployment data. So financial services still ahead of everybody else. In some, presumably their own niche applications, but that includes cryptocurrencies as well. Transportation, utilities, insurance, you can see again what. So healthcare providers are very interested, but they, in deployment, they at the very bottom of those things. Because so healthcare industry is sort of driven by multiple considerations, their technology, awareness, and sophistication is probably not very high. So are there any real success stories and benefits? So here's what I learned from IBM. IBM claimed that they can trace food products on average from 7 days before implementation of blockchain to 2 seconds. IBM Global Finance, which manages their suppliers. IBM in their supply chain have over 1,000 different suppliers. They're providing all sorts of things to IBM. And between suppliers and IBM, there is always disputes. What was sent, when, to whom, was it damaged, and all these things. So they claim that they freed, and when these disputes arise, the money that is in dispute is escrow. And so they claim that the 100 million that's stuck in reconciliation was, they freed 3/4 of that, if you believe them. And the number of sort of the activity, number of the time required to facilitate these activities goes almost 4 times faster. Cross-border payments, they claim that they have this via cryptocurrency. I didn't see any example of that, but they claim that they sort of really established that. That 15,000 suppliers, I already mentioned that. This is a Swiss example. They tokenize physical real estate property. So they now have tokens that is reflective of real estate assets in Switzerland to the tune of 134 million euro, or Swiss francs in this case. And that means that you can trade on that blockchain. You can create transaction without actually going through other paper applications. The rest of it, it's this Ethereum platform is the platform that created by this Canadian guy, Butelin. And that is the platform that using smart contracts extensively. This is one of the, and they use different mechanisms for reconciliation. Instead of proof of work, they speed up the platform compared to traditional Bitcoins. Still, major applications are in gambling and exchange in cryptocurrencies. So these other ideas that this can democratize market, enable new insight in artificial intelligence, and ransomware is another application. So my last slide. So it is a clever tool. This digital ledger, it's a clever tool. Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things. There's no question about that. And in some carefully selected, based on well understood criteria. And that was what I tried to describe. You put together the concept, the setup, and then your application. And then the third aspect of that is criteria, which is the flow chart that I showed you. And when you exercise that, you see whether your application really can be used. But by all means, there are some applications that have huge limitations and unlikely that ever will be subject to DLT. And so the controllable characteristics of those things, which is the size, access to the network, allowed smart contract, type and management of input data, it's really have to be defined after very careful technical and economic analysis of application. That's the trick. This is the kind of consulting, actually, I was about to engage in this type of work with my and Bob's previous boss, Jim Eichner. We discussed this thing. So this is sort of how I approach that. If I would have a chance to look at actual application, I would execute something like that. Now, regulatory issues, most of you know what GDPR is. It's a very stringent European regulation concerning private data. And you have to be very, very careful implementing different applications that deals with the customer data. There are rules. This remains niche application because, well, despite the expectation that Bitcoin would become universal currency and replace dollars or euros or Swiss franc, it's not going to happen in foreseeable future. And supply chain seems to be, based on the examples I given to you, seems to be a workable application. There are tangible benefits there. That is all.
Would you like to open the floor to questions?
Yes, I'll be happy to answer the question. You want me to share with you the story how I cheated Germans of their money?
I would love to hear that story.
So I was stupid enough to travel in Frankfurt in Germany by car. Not advisable. There is wonderful public transportation. I came by car, and there's a very expensive parking lot. And I get into the parking lot, and I got the ticket. And walking from the parking lot, the guarded parking lot, I start thinking about information that printed on the ticket. And binding between that information and my car that was actually parked in the parking lot. And I've come to the conclusion there is no binding. There is no indication of what kind of car, except there's a ticket with the timing information. And so I decided that maybe if I'm clever enough, I will be able to trigger the ticket issue. And 3 days later, I triggered the ticket that was for 2 hours instead of 3 days. And then I presented this ticket and paid for 2 hours instead of 3 days. But that was an experiment. So I'm sure they fixed it after that. But that's the idea of binding physical things related to location, the type of the physical asset, all the characteristics of physical asset, and digital information that it's is an example how you can take advantage of somewhat tenuous binding. All right, I'm done. So let me just.
Very good.
So Leon, that binding in the postal payment system, it's the same problem, right?
Of course, of course. That's where we started, and that's what forced me to think about that. And I think in the postal, I mean, because the applications in the postal case is much more limited. In other words, the variability of the media you're dealing with in the postal world is somewhat more limited than in the context of insurance, for example, right? So in that sense, it's probably somewhat easier to solve, to deal with. And if you have extremely valuable items, you send it by courier. So I don't know anybody who sends a $5 million painting by post.
But in principle, you could sell a car using blockchain instead of signing off on a title. And in this way, you could have your blockchain bound to the physical entity, the car. And then when people are taking ownership, they have a chain of ownership. Normally, this thing with the title, it's so fragile. And if it's made out improperly, you need to go and seek a new title, and it's quite a pain.
Of course, you're absolutely right. So if you think about that carefully, what exactly is the information about the car that it's stored in the title?
Usually it's something like a year, model, make, and perhaps a VIN number. And often there's odometry, which is written next to it. And then there's the price of the sale, so that people can get assessed a sales tax, which is typical of many states, if not all.
Right. And well, if you start asking yourself, may I have another car, not the one that is parameterized in the title, but would have the same parameters because I simply counterfeit certain information. That's the issue of binding. Is that VIN, if you nail out all the parts of the car that contains this VIN information, can they be cut and replaced? So I'll give you an example that would clarify what I mean by that. In the art and antique market, there was a very famous, world famous jeweler by the name Fabergé. He made this famous X for the Russian Tsar. And they worth now millions and millions and millions of dollars. They were made of gold and precious stones. But he also made lots of other objects, jewelry and other objects. So now I would venture to say that 3/4 of the Fabergé that's circulating now in antique markets, they're all fake. But they have authentic stamp of the producer. So here's how you do that. You create a fancy looking silver object, okay, which you just did. And then you buy relatively inexpensively a fork that was made by Fabergé in 1910. And then you cut the name Fabergé and the stamp with the silver and all these things, and you carefully solder that inside your silver object, and then you polish that and you put it on the market as Fabergé. That's how it works. So you can think of similar process for the purpose of the car. So that's what I mean by difficulty of the irrefutable, unbreakable binding.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah. So basically, in this, you said this authenticity feature of this established trust of a physical thing through this digital presentation. So so now when we're talking about the blockchain, we talk about technology and is in what type of deployment in the product form. Like say how IBM, is IBM making the blockchain product to sell to the customer, and how it is done? You know, how the commercialization of the blockchain as a product from the operator.
So IBM, as I said, they have this standardized implementation of the blockchain called Hyperledger. That means that you have a basic structure, including all the pieces. That means that if you have a computer, you can join IBM blockchain because they'll give you a piece of software which would enable you to initiate transaction. And then transaction will go to the other participants in the network and they will be verified, and then it will go and add to the block. So what they do, IBM has that technology, plus they have what I call consulting sales force. Their sales force going to beef producers or other people using supply, almost everybody is using supply chain nowadays, as you know. And they try to peddle that visibility and unbreakability and protection of the records to all these people. And if they choose to act upon that, IBM will do implementation using their Hyperledger. So IBM offered that both as a technology and as a service.
Okay.
And that's what, so for example, that deal with Maersk is exactly how it's done. So Maersk did not develop this technology, just partner with IBM, and they tracing all this huge number of containers that travel all over the world by sea. It's now seems to be traced and managed by the blockchains.
Thank you.
So Bitcoin seems to use on your chart with the challenges, right? The energy consumption one. Bitcoin uses a huge amount of energy, right?
That's right.
The other blockchains are much, if you're just using a blockchain, not trying to mine Bitcoins, it's a lot different.
That's right. That's exactly right. And well, that's why you see the proof of work, which was the original concept, to avoid double spending.
Mm-hmm.
So when Bitcoin was conceptualized, the proof of work was the concept to avoid double spending. It's simply, you can do that, but you will spend more than you gain from that. That's the idea. But then, because it has so much power consumption, it's so difficult. And in case of the Bitcoin, the number of Bitcoins is limited by design. Ethereum use a different. They use proof of stake, which is much cheaper than proof. In other words, there is, as always, you see, proof of work is very pure concept. You have, on a technical terms, Bob, you know better than anybody else, you have to find a hash value that has certain number of leading zeros, or you have to find a hash value with certain numerical property. And because there is no good cheating algorithm which would enable you to do that, you simply have to you simply have to do exhaustive search. That's what you do. You do exhaustive search. And it's a pure concept. But
it turns out that, sorry for interrupting, but turns out that the amount of power used by Bitcoin is equal to the amount of power consumed by Switzerland.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's why all other proofs are there. What I was about to say that you can start using contextual information. As I said, it's a very pure concept in the case of proof of work. We don't care who you are, you just give me that value that has 15 leading zero. And then I know that you have it, that's all. But there is a contextual information in the overall blockchain. And you can start saying, well, this is how I separate cheaters from the honest people there. And if you use that, it allows you to spend less energy and less computation. That's always the idea, how much information you get in to convince yourself that something is genuine, right?
So I thought, are there any more questions first?
Yeah, just Bill here. Suppose there was a concept of using blockchain to swap government securities where three parties would be involved, both the A and the B, and then an intermediary who took a piece of the transaction. Would IBM be willing to supply everyone with a hyperledger and kind of coax them to get off and start trading with a little bit of consulting?
Well, that's my understanding. So my understanding is that IBM is willing to provide a platform for this kind of things. Just like, well, that's why they call it platform, because if you look at, Apple or Amazon, you and I can trade on Amazon. I can offer you something, or eBay. It's a platform. And so IBM is willing to create blockchain-based platform for different transactions. That's my understanding of the intent. And they want to own the platform. And so in other words, they're going to make money by taking a little cut here and there in terms of.
I'm thinking probably one of the problems with that type of arrangement with buyers and sellers, A's and B's, and an intermediary C takes a few basis points, that one of the issues would be essentially what used to be called the back office problem of swapping documents. How does A do the input to B? Is there, if let's say it's a treasury, a 10-year treasury, and somebody else wants to buy it at a particular price, how does A make the input of his 10-year treasury note? Because that could be a physical thing, or it could be, in the United States case, I think that information is kept at the Federal Reserve. But I'm thinking of, not third world, but second world countries where financial markets aren't developed. Thinking in particular back, I guess, 25 years ago, my brother had a financial service in Brazil. And I recently asked him, I said, well, what about your regulation? What about the SEC? And his answer was, there was no regulator at that time. And I'm rather thinking that many countries don't have regulators and don't even have systems of trading, and not just of securities. But there's an economist, I believe his name is De Soto. He had a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about how in the third world, there's essentially ownership but no documentation. Property is productive, whether you can grow crops or graze cattle or extract minerals, but there's no documentation. There's no deeds like we have here in the United States. I would think that type of area would be ripe for institutionalizing on a platform like IBM's.
Well, that's exactly right. Actually, in my slide with list all the application, there was this undeveloped world. There's a whole bunch of application listed there. Another one, and Bob knows again because we spent so much time together, Pitney Bowes at some point in time worked on the arrangement that would authenticate diplomas, university diplomas or institution diplomas. Now the DLT would be a good platform because it's a public record of what education you have. And it turned out that in India, where that application we worked on at the time, that was particularly rampant problem because people misrepresented their credentials quite often. And we were told that it's a problem. Right, Bob?
Yeah, it was another good business opportunity we didn't do.
Yet I think all this is dependent on government recognition of the validity of the process.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you're in Cuba and you own something, you really don't unless the government recognizes the fact that you own it, no matter what documentation you have. So I guess one prerequisite above the technical aspects is some sort of legitimate government, legitimate, reliable, honest government that would recognize a deed, whether it's paper or electronics. And that might be the limitation in third world countries. I'm sure as hell it wouldn't be in Cuba. They'd tell you whether you owned a company or a piece of property or whatever, no matter what paper or whatever documentation you had through a hyperledger that you bought it from, you know, Bob Conway 10 years ago or whatever.
Well, the issue is, as maybe I mentioned that last time, issue is always control. And so is it technically feasible to have cryptocurrency that would be widely used and would avoid all the paper money or everything else and would be totally decentralized and would be ideal media of exchange? And the answer is probably yes, probably with some stretch you can have it. The question is what the central bank will do and the bankers, and they don't want to lose control of any of those things because it's a source of income and it's a source of control, which is very important to them. So David Chom, who was a brilliant American scientist, and he built the first concept of totally decentralized, beautifully fair, properly managed money, which he called DigiCash, and started company in Amsterdam back in the late 80s, almost 89, 90. And on paper, everything, all the protocols, all the exchanges, every single cyber attack was thought of and protected against, everything was working. And for 10 years, he was trying to sell the concept to anybody. He was funded by venture capital, and it's miserably failed. There was no way to get through the government or banking consortiums to get any of those things. As soon as they heard decentralized, no controls, they said, no,
right,
not for us.
So I'm reminded of Mayor Amschel Rothschild, who said, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws."
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's and that's why he's a Rothschild. Yes.
You know, and now we think, well, perhaps Bitcoin allows us to avoid the big bad bonus bankers who apparently are able to essentially socialize risk and privatize profits, and have, I think, rightly caused a certain number of people to essentially go into these movements. I believe they call it Occupy Wall Street. I thought that was a righteous movement, but whatever happened to that? It just sort of fizzled out. But anyway, I'd like to describe what we're doing on next month. We'll have Eric Schultz, who is the author of Innovation on Tap, talk to us on the 29th of September. He's a CEO and entrepreneur, has done several startups, so you could say he's a serial entrepreneur. And his Innovation on Tap describes his work as a venture capitalist, and I think we might enjoy hearing from him. So this will be a new speaker for us, and I think what happens as a speaker chair during these times of Zoom meetings is we can reach out beyond the local geographic regions and try and get new and interesting speakers that are outside of my normal address book, which is extremely important. But I also need your help. So if you happen to have anybody that you think might be a good speaker that we can put on our list, do let me know so that we can queue them up, because otherwise you're going to hear the same kinds of people that you've been hearing, and I'd like to make it so that we can mix it up and hear new people. It's always good to hear from you, though, Leon. I'm very glad you did your talk, and I thank you very much. And unless you guys have any more questions, I think it's we're going to call it a night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leon.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
interesting.
Appreciate your time. Thank you. Have a good.
Stay safe.
You too.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
All right.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Be well.